Okay, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this lecture in our series on world disorder. My name's Jonathan Haslam. I'm the George F. Kennan Professor, and it's a great pleasure today to have as our speaker Richard Murphy, who has an extraordinary length of time involved in Middle Eastern affairs since graduating from Harvard in the early 50s and serving really across the Arab world. He was, his high point of his career, I think, when I first met him years ago, was when he was Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern and South Asian Affairs. And as a true Arabist, it wasn't easy, I have to say. I was living in Washington at the time. The term Arabist wasn't a term of enormous respect, but these were people who really knew what was going on the ground. And I vividly remember a conversation which totally misfired when I first met him at a party he was giving in about 1984. And I'm a Russianist, so I was trying to pump him about Russian policy on the Iran-Iraq war, which was going on at the time. And every time I mentioned Russia, I was told, Russia's got nothing to do with this. And eventually, of course, I had no idea what was going on in the Reagan administration, what the arguments were. But then eventually, after a great deal of reflection, I realized that this was somebody who was concerned with the politics of the region, to which other things were merely peripheral, including my own treasured area. And after that, when I went to receptions, I learned to keep my tongue. But today, Richard, you will have seen on the web, if you haven't already heard him, he's very unusual because as a former Foreign Service officer, he is all over the web. He has been on all the talk shows that I've seen, and focusing in on the issues of the region from somebody who has lived and worked, and it has to be said, in one of the most difficult parts of the world to get anything done. And the notion of forging peace in the Middle East, most people would have given up years ago, but I have to say Richard has never, ever given up. So a warm welcome to him now. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. I did work many years in the Middle East, and you can see the results. But it's an honor to speak to you today. By way of explanation, the title is one that, I was asked to provide a title rather quickly because they were trying to get the notices out, and the best I could come up with was Who Lost the Middle East? And I picked that up in my early years of service in the State Department's Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs, when it was a running joke among the junior officers. What are you going to say when Congress asked you, why did you lose the Middle East? Well, the joke was not a great one because it came from watching our betters in the State Department appearing before Congress where they were bluntly accused of ignorance or malfeasance, often of both. Of course, that's a way of saying good morning in Washington, as you know. Well, my own answer, first off, is that the United States, including its diplomats, are innocent of the charge because the Middle East was never ours to lose. Some Americans have had illusions about the extent of our control in the area. I'm referring to a recent example in the invasion of Iraq. And we have damaged some fragile structures of government. But for most Americans, the Middle East has always been somebody else's property. As remote as when Mark Twain was visiting out there in the 1860s, and wrote that a desolation is here that not even imagination can grace with the pomp of life and action. I would not desire to live here. It is a hopeless, dreary, heartbroken land. I think that most Americans would probably say the same thing about Syria, Iraq, and Libya, to name only a few countries currently in the news. In the late 19th century, we did toy with the vision of becoming an imperial power. It was the thing to be. But we soon rejected the ambition. We quickly redefined our relationship with the Philippines, for instance, after winning it from the Spanish in the 1890s. And we occupied it, but we quickly renamed it a commonwealth under our governor general that was going to guide them to full independence. And we put a date on it just before the Second World War. In the Middle East, we were never part of the pack, hungrily eyeing the region in the declining years of the Ottoman Empire. European ambitions to divide up the area were very neatly laid out by the British, the French civil service during the First World War in the Sykes-Picot Agreement. It's derided today as the last gasp of imperial ambition. But that agreement did take some regional characteristics into account. The authors were not as haphazard as it reads today in drawing national frontiers, which persisted since the 1920s. Well, I'm going to speak primarily about personal experiences today, but I did want to cite briefly some writing of Dr. Lisa Anderson, who until last December was president of the American University of Cairo, and who's done a lot of interesting work on the area. She argues that many in the Arab world found the European-style state imposed after World War I to be an awkward fit. Parliaments were created which masked the reality that in the interwar period, real decisions were made by the European home governments. Industrialization was neglected, welfare was emphasized, but the end result at independence, the rulers never inherited, nor were they constrained by institutions designed to guarantee the government's domestic accountability. Westerners, including ourselves, have elevated statehood as the symbol of modernity. And many Middle Easterners found that their older reliance on family, ethnic, and religious ties worked better to obtain the necessities of daily life. Anderson lists a long history of complex and orderly communities of tribes, churches, empires, trade federations, aristocracies, religious brotherhoods, and other expressions of human ingenuity. In a word, it became apparent that the pre-industrial welfare states established by the Europeans, sustained by the industrial world's growing reliance on petroleum and superpower rivalries of the Cold War, failed to deliver. Before the Second World War, American knowledge of the region was spotty. President Wilson explicitly supported independence for the non-Turkish minorities of the Ottoman Empire, but never closely examined the histories of those minorities. Hollywood romanticized the Middle East in those years, still does to a degree. Our economic interests were minor until the 1930s, when major oil deposits were confirmed in Saudi Arabia. President Roosevelt initially was not persuaded they were all that significant. But as soon as the Second World War got underway, they were renamed national security interests. Revelations of the Holocaust shocked our national conscience, and after the war, Zionists, both Jewish and Christian, focused our interest on the issue of Palestine. When I arrived in Beirut in 1959, if you remember that year, I viewed the Middle East as the focus of Russian-American rivalries, the lens of the Cold War. Indeed, Cold War thinking was pervasive and was partially the reason that I'd volunteered for Arabic language study. I'd been vice consul in an isolated office in Africa when I heard President Eisenhower's speech in 1956 ordering the French, the British, and the Israelis to get out of the Suez Canal zone. Far from the scene, I learned his anger was stoked, in particular, by his view that their activities in Egypt constituted very serious difficulties for his efforts to mobilize international opinion against the Soviet military interventions in Hungary. I concluded that for as much, perhaps as a decade ahead, an American diplomat would find that region with major power conflicts complicated and challenging as a place to serve. Well, I was right. I badly underestimated the time span. My language studies started the year after the Iraqi Revolution. Eisenhower had ordered the landing of 5,000 Marines in Beirut, the summer of '58, in an effort to lower the political temperature in the area, which was threatening further upheavals and, we were concerned, would increase Soviet influence. Many of us who served in the Middle East in the decades after Suez now look back on the Cold War with nostalgia. As diplomats, it clarified our understanding of our position in the region and it defined our goals in individual countries. The Middle East was more responsive then than it is today to displays of U.S. power. In 1958, those 5,000 Marines survived their weeks in Beirut with only one fatality, which was not combat-related. In fact, their landing had been somewhat embarrassing for our fully armed troops as they waded ashore through the Beirut surf, ready for action, to find themselves confronted by a welcoming cohort of Lebanese kids hawking chiclets. They were wet but unsatisfied as warriors. The State Department's Arabic language school was on an upper floor of a nondescript, minimally guarded building, which a generation later was to win notoriety when it was blown up by the precursor of the Lebanese Hezbollah party, which killed many U.S. diplomats and Lebanese staff. Our school director was a Lebanese American from Michigan State who had the good sense to urge us after long days of intensive language drill, conducted Berlitz style. We had just 3 students per teacher. And he said, don't take the language tapes home for further study. Much better if you spend your evenings attending Egyptian movies or wandering around downtown Beirut. Downtown soon proved more interesting than Egyptian films, which were barely at the level of early Bollywood in the industry. And Beirut was a Middle Eastern city once you penetrated beyond the block or two along the Mediterranean edge. It was a stretch to call it the Paris of the Middle East, but it was a fascinating mix of cultures. The director also organized for us a week-long stay with some relatives of his in a village down in southern Lebanon. All in all, the society was so welcoming that I had no hesitation about taking my family to a village above Beirut where we spent the last 2 months. I would commute down to the school, and the family was in a rented schoolhouse, and we found an outfitter to produce some rental beds. In the Middle East, the Soviet-American competition had strengthened the military officers who were running Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, having seized power from traditional leaders such as the Egyptian, the Iraqi kings. The Soviets ardently courted these officers, and the new leaders asserted their own legitimacy by contrasting their regimes with those of their neighbors, whom they said were imperialist stooges. Those who had failed to defend Arab rights in Palestine was a favorite theme. Abdel Nasser joined the Third World Leadership Circle of Nehru and Tito. Arab nationalism, Arab unity were the flavors of the day. Even after Syria defected from the United Arab Republic of Egypt and Syria to reassert its own identity in 1961. Of course, Nasser's appeal as a hero waned very quickly after his disaster in the Six-Day War, and no one has yet to replace him as the object of mass adulation among the Arabs. We viewed it as a big American win during the Cold War when Sadat ordered all Soviet military advisors out of Egypt. We blocked the Soviets from the Gulf area through our commitment to the security of the Arab Gulf states. I recall one hearing of the House Foreign Affairs Committee when I looking back somewhat embarrassingly, pompously reminded its members of the ambition of Catherine the Great to have her soldiers wash their feet in the warm waters of the Gulf. That silenced them for at least 2 minutes. Well, directly after language school, I transferred to become consul in Aleppo, and from 1960 to 63 served there. I witnessed Nasser's triumphant visit to the city and to the chaos, political chaos, which swept Syria after they had cut the ties between themselves and Egypt. The UAR collapsed, and I reported on the difficulties that the Syrian political leaders were having as they tried to come together and reach a stated goal of a multi-party government. The Ba'ath Party abruptly seized power in 1963 and eliminated domestic political competition from that year really to today. The inability of Syrian politicians in the 1960s to yield pride of place and coordinate their individual ambitions continues to plague the country today. I returned to the country as ambassador in 1974, reopening diplomatic relations which the Syrians had cut at the time of the Six-Day War. And that was an assignment which was a vivid lesson in Cold War complexities. A few days after my arrival, I paid a protocol call on the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, the Soviet ambassador. He was cordial and said that he wanted to make one main point. He knew that Washington considered Syria to be a Soviet puppet. It's true, he said, that Syria accepts everything from Russia: arms, grants, loans, major student exchange program. It accepts everything except our advice. I hope you'll think about this as you begin your assignment. Well, my first reaction was I was hearing a very shrewd tactic to throw this newly arrived capitalist colleague off balance. But I've come to appreciate his view that it was a well-intentioned offer also to share his insight into Syrian psychology. And I'm very pleased at least the beginnings of cooperation between ourselves and Russia today, trying to help out in Syria. I did feel basically at odds with the peace policies of both the Nixon and the Carter administrations. I saw Syria as potentially the key player who might pull the whole area together into a general Arab peace agreement with Israel. Hafez al-Assad was the undisputed leader, stubborn, extremely slow to move, but he was ready to listen. He was a player that we would have to draw on extra patience to deal with. He cordially received Kissinger and then Cyrus Vance as our secretaries. Kissinger had won his favor by painstakingly mediating the return to Syrian sovereignty of that sliver of land on the Golan Heights, which it had seized during the 73 war. Kissinger himself described his month-long shuttle between Damascus and Jerusalem as when I got to know every damn rock and bush on the Golan. Assad said he was convinced and was operating on the basis that only if Arab unity was preserved and they negotiated as a group that could a real peace be reached. Whatever Kissinger may have hoped to do to involve Syria in the peace process, the Israelis simply did not have that as a priority, especially if it meant returning any more land on the Golan Heights. It focused on Egypt, and negotiations soon started, which culminated 5 years later in the Camp David Accord and the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. Assad was left behind to orate against Egypt and to boast that Syria was the leader of the Steadfastness Front. But he never regained Washington's attention as a serious player, even when late in the 1980s he said he was ready for a peace of the brave. My own tour as an ambassador there was a honeymoon in our relations. Both countries wanted to see what could be done to improve bilateral ties. His door was always open. He enjoyed lengthy meetings. I think the longest I had was 6 hours, and I cannot remember what we accomplished. They were all conducted in his office, where he sat under a large painting of the victory over the Crusader forces by the Arabs, admittedly an Arab force led by a Kurd, Salah ad-Din. He let the painting speak for itself. In my last session with him in 1988, I remarked that in all the years we'd known each other, I couldn't recall a single agreement that he offered with any of the proposals that I had offered. Always ready with the last word in a good Syrian tradition, he said, "Well, you never had a good one." On Baghdad, I first went there in 1984. The Iranian Revolution had been 5 years earlier, and America's memory of having our embassy occupied and the staff held hostage was fresh and bitter. The Iran-Iraq War started in 1980, when Saddam Hussein sought to gain a quick advantage over what he assumed was a demoralized and a weakened Iranian military. He misjudged, and he was soon losing his bet. We were urged by a whole range of Arab countries to find ways of helping him. Even the Saudis, who had been critical of Saddam, said, "When this war is over, If he wins, you'll see he'll be a different man. Saddam's regime had no admirers in Washington, but we accepted that a foe of Iran couldn't be all that bad. So we started to support Iraq, and we urged a reopening of diplomatic relations. The Reagan administration had very few face-to-face dealings with Saddam. My own dealings were with the senior level, had been with the foreign minister, Tariq Aziz, who was a former journalist, a Chaldean Christian, and an affable and senior diplomat, yes, and a skillful one. When he wore an army uniform in Baghdad, he always looked somewhat uncomfortable wearing the large revolver on his belt. On my visits, I'm thinking of the one in late '85, I brought with me a letter from President Reagan to Saddam, presenting, as is customary, a copy to the foreign minister earlier. It was a straightforward description of our policy to deny arms deliveries to Iran. Well, if you think back, it was the time, and it was just before my visit, that a rather bizarre rumor had started to circulate in Washington about a cargo of American arms carried to Tehran on an Israeli military aircraft, which was forced down or came down in Turkey. Had not been informed of what had been underway, of what turned out to be a much too clever effort known as Iran-Contra, intended to encourage Iranian help in securing the release of American hostages in Lebanon. Initial details were limited. There'd been no public reaction from Baghdad to the rumor at the time of my trip. Later, I learned that Saddam had been enraged. The afternoon of my arrival, the foreign minister called to say that I should stand by for a meeting with the president. It took place at night in one of the presidential palaces, to which we were escorted by a member of his personal guard. Accompanied by our ambassador, and after walking down a long, dark corridor, I entered Saddam's office to find the president, his interpreter, and the foreign minister present. I presented the original of the Reagan letter, adding some further details about our continuing efforts to deny arms to Iran from any source, including from some of our closest allies. Well, he glanced at the text and tersely replied, "We could do more." He then sat back and asked me if I realized just how much U.S. policy towards the third world resembled that of an Iraqi peasant farmer towards his new wife. Sensing a setup, I could only say, no. He said nothing. I said, how? I'll tell you, the United States behaves towards the third world like that peasant does after the wedding, 5 days of bread and honey and off to the fields for life. The foreign minister began to laugh so hard he nearly fell out of his chair. His reaction may well have been written into his job description, but he played it very well, as if he just heard history's finest example of presidential wit. Saddam smilingly acknowledged the tribute. Our meeting ended shortly thereafter. I returned to my hotel where every window was bulletproofed. And as I drew the curtain shut, I accepted that Saddam was partly right about our foreign policy. Also, he had a remarkable self-control in not referring to the rumored arms shipments we had made to Tehran. It testified to the cynicism with which a leader of a small power had to bring to bear in his dealings with a treacherous world. The Iran-Iraq War ended 3 years later. Saddam then invaded Kuwait, disproving the Arab world's prediction that he would be a changed man. Saudi-American relations preoccupied me both abroad and in Washington. I was political officer in Jeddah, transferring from Aleppo in 1963, returning as ambassador in 1981. Faisal had been king when I left in 1966. His crown prince Khalid was the king to whom I presented my credentials. I dealt with Abdullah when he was chief of the National Guard and later as crown prince, and with Salman as governor of Riyadh, then crown prince until his accession to the throne last year. If this sounds like a system of calm and orderly succession to power, it was, at least as far as outsiders could tell. The best guidance for any foreigner inquiring about issues directly affecting the royal family in Saudi Arabia is to realize that those who talk don't know, and those who know don't talk. The royal family is massive, with over 7,000 princes in the direct and collateral lines. In that huge number of family members, all of whom get some level of annual subsidy, there are some extremely able, well-educated people and some less so. Not all the princes have the title of royal. That has to be direct descent from the kingdom's founder, Abdulaziz bin Saud. Accession has always been worked out behind the closed doors. Age has been a primary qualification for the kingship among the sons of the founder, but not the only one. Over the decades, princes have voluntarily stepped aside or been skipped over by family agreement. Last year saw the long-awaited generational shift, having worked their way through Abdulaziz's 42 sons. The first of the founder's grandsons was named to the position of crown prince. Soon afterwards came the further surprise when King Salman gave extraordinary powers over defense and economic policy to his 30-year-old, comparatively unknown son Muhammad, appointing him as deputy crown prince. The basic understanding between our country and Saudi Arabia over the decades has consisted of two pledges. The United States would assure Saudi security against external aggression. The Saudis would assure a regular supply of oil at reasonable prices, and by and large, the pledges have been honored. Saudi Arabia even supplied the U.S. market at a discounted price for a number of years. It boycotted our market only once in reaction to Arab League demand that dealings would be severely cut back with the United States in reaction to our very widely publicized airlift of arms to Israel during the 1973 war. Even then, the Saudis quietly eased the boycott after a few months to allow shipments to our Pacific fleet. We sold arms to the Saudi military as the government developed its defenses against the perceived threat, principally from Iran. There were times when our Congress objected on the grounds that these arms could be used against Israel, notably the sale of early warning aircraft, the AWACS, in the 1980s, but the president himself lobbied directly and successfully to promote that sale. Later we came to Saudi defense by sending 500,000 troops when Saddam, having occupied Kuwait, put his forces in a position to move further, and that meant down into Saudi Arabia. Well, over the years, Washington's been accused of being overly tolerant in its dealings with the Saudis. The regime's abuses of human rights have been reported annually in the Human Rights Report, but they've never triggered American sanctions. Have our leaders been effectively bought off from criticizing because of major American investments by the Saudis, major Saudi purchases? I will never deny the weight of the military-industrial complex in Washington, but I have witnessed over the decades Saudi policy decisions favoring American interests in regional stability. The royal family's message to its own people has consistently been, well, just look around. Look at the situation in the so-called revolutionary, the progressive states. Do you want that with the upheavals it brings, or the peace and welfare of being a Saudi? And by and large, Saudi public has opted for the latter. The regime has its critics. They're closely watched, and some of them harshly repressed. But these critics have not been able to develop, at least as yet, a large enough following to threaten the legitimacy of the rulers. And the rulers have kept a channel of communication open at all levels in their hierarchy between the people and the government through the so-called system of the Majlis. That system is less effective today as the bureaucracy has grown, but it still exists. However, there is a serious challenge, and a growing one, which is proving difficult for the Saudi leadership to manage and for the West to ignore. The promotion of sectarianism through official and private Saudi financing of groups adhering to its hardline version and views of Islam. Riyadh has long distrusted its Shiite subjects. It has never opened the higher levels of the Saudi government, the military, or Aramco. This was not in itself a problem for US-American relations. Today, however, the Saudis are using sectarianism as a political weapon abroad, and not just to express theological differences. They've used it to sponsor or counter other governments in the region. Riyadh, for example, which views the advancement of power of the Iraqi Shiites to run the state of Iraq, they see that as an American gift to Iran because of a result of our invasion. We said, you guys better follow the solid principle of one man, one vote, and there were more Shia. Well, the Saudis reportedly are funding extremist Sunni Iraqi groups affiliated with the Islamic State. There are other reports of Saudi money reaching state followers of ISIS, that is ISIS, in Syria. Obama's recent appeal to the Saudis that Riyadh share the regional leadership with Iran has fallen on totally deaf ears. Can Washington do more to make the Saudi government aware of the threat that such policies pose to itself? Well, Riyadh knows that it's a target of ISIS. It knows that it would be an enormous prize for ISIS to control the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. The government has enlisted the support of the Grand Mufti in the kingdom and many of the leading clergy denouncing ISIS as an agent of terrorism. It's also aware of the appeal of a restored caliphate to wealthy Saudis who knowingly continue to finance ISIS, whom they see as a tough Sunni force which fights the Shia usurpers in Baghdad and the Assad regime in Syria. But Riyadh does not want to weaken the support that it gets from its clergy and its conservative, most conservative citizenry by a frontal attack on their political views. well, for it to do so would be as if Washington denounced as un-American our popular conviction that we must continue our mission as a shining city on the hill. In conclusion, I ask, what does it mean to be a Saudi, a Syrian, or any other nationalities whose borders are still so clearly marked on the area maps? As I said, I don't think Sykes and Picot during the First World War got it entirely wrong. Pride can have its ugly side, but it's also an essential ingredient of patriotism. In 1960, when I arrived in Aleppo, Syrians spoke very proudly of themselves as distinct, as superior to their neighbors in Iraq. Iraqis were barbaric, unable to resolve their differences except through bloodshed. The Hashemites controlling Jordan were simply Western puppets. The Lebanese were lesser beings with a derisory political system to whom, as needed, stable Syria would offer refuge. Egyptians and Omanis are probably the only Arab peoples in the Arab world who, over time, have been what I call being comfortable in their own skin. When Sadat reached his peace treaty with Israel, he was denounced across the Arab world. Egypt was expelled from the Arab League. He shrugged. Egypt is its own master. We're proud of our history and our modern identity. Oman had once ruled its own empire in Zanzibar, Baluchistan. The Sultan preserved Omani pride by consistently steering clear of inter-Arab tensions. He didn't allow a Palestine Liberation Office to be opened in Muscat, and he ignored calls to join in Arab denunciations of Iran. The older network of Middle East states may be lost. If so, it's a waste of time to try to apportion blame. Today, the questions are, will it be possible for those countries to revive whose territory has been wrenched apart by civil war, decimated by a flood of refugees? Will leaders in other countries which are still intact but face rising demands from their people, will they agree to share power? We don't want to own the Middle East, but perhaps we could better keep looking for ways, working with other states outside of the region, to help it find itself. Thank you.